Located in the southeastern region of the Northern Range in Trinidad, the Cumaca cave system is a vast network of caverns formed by the river that flows through it. From small to massive, these caverns reach deep into the mountainside, with many remaining largely unexplored. It was the lure of a rumoured secret cavern that drew the British Sub-Aqua Club to the site, but for two young members of the team, their curiosity and overconfidence proved to be their downfall. This is the tragic tale of the Cumaca cave disaster of 1964. It was March the 22nd in the year of 1964. Hans Booz was a mere 25 years old, having been a member of the Trinidad and Tobago Field Naturalist Club for about 4 years, when on the calendar of activities there was a planned trip to the Cumaca caves in Plantanal, deep in the northern ridge. Here, the largest colony of gucharos, or oilbirds, Stetornis catrapentis, are said to still exist in large numbers. The caves were accessible only by foot, passing through the numerous old cocoa estates that once belonged to the Leotold family. So, on that fateful day, along with his younger brother, Julius Booz, in a convoy of cars carrying other members and friends of the club, they drove slowly up the 9 miles of tortuous road to the Plantanal Valley. Parking at the side of the road where a smaller dirt patch led upwards to the hillside, it became apparent that the Field Naturalist Club was not the only entity which had planned to go in the caves that day. Unloading their cars and vans were the members of the local branch of the British Sub-Aqua Club. One of their members, Vincent Abraham, happened to be both a member of the British Sub-Aqua Club and the Trinidad and Tobago Field Naturalist Club, and he explained that the happy circumstances that brought them together were totally unplanned. The Sub-Aqua Club had been diving on the site where the Spanish Admiral Apodaca had burnt and scuttled his ships at their anchorage of the island of Gasperi. The Sub-Aqua Club had then decided to do some caving in the only cave that lent itself to this sort of underwater exploration, and to attempt to put rest of old legend that there were other inner caves a short swim from the emergence of the Cumaca River in the depths of the cave. The legends of these inner caves arose from a rumour that an ancient Ameri Indian had made the swim and came back to tell the tale, which was confirmed by a US soldier posted to Trinidad during World War II. He is said to have made the swim too, and in those days there was no sophisticated underwater gear at hand. It is speculated that he had a pair of swimming goggles to make the swim, as the now familiar face mask and scuba gear were certainly not available at that time. But there was enough optimism rising from the stories and from the experiences of the British that there would be little trouble in either finding this fabled underwater cavern or dispelling the myth forever. Perhaps it was this optimism and devil-may-care attitude that was to result in the tragic events that would unfold later in the day. After about an hour or so walking, the Field Naturalist Club arrived at the old estate buildings, a row of wooden shacks, along with quarters for the workers of the almost now defunct estate. As the Naturalist Club prepared themselves for the hike into the cave itself, they were giving guidelines for their safety on entering the cave by the workers, and told what to expect, and the do's and don'ts concerning the flashlights that startled the oilbirds. The Sub-Aqua Club had set off before the Naturalist Club, and was nowhere to be seen as they arrived at the entrance to the cave, a large angled fissure in a cliff face. One by one, Hans, his brother Julius, and the rest of the Naturalist Club stepped into the shallow river and waded into the darkness of the cave. They could hear the earthly screeches up in the darkness ahead, and as they got deeper and deeper into the cave, this devilish squalling became progressively louder as it grew darker, and the club's flashlights had to light the way with every step. Overhead, the birds were rushing about in the light, piercing the darkness, and a constant drizzle of bird urine and droppings began to rain down. Added to that, they were sure that they heard some bats too, as they could see their dark shapes fluttering about above their heads. On the banks of the river, there were huge piles of bird and bat guano, accumulated over the years. Guano is the accumulated excrement of birds or bats, and on this guano, black and smelly stunted forest palm seedlings were growing, all reaching upward like ghosts to a non-existent light. Without the light to begin the process of photosynthesis, they would grow only until they had exhausted their supply of food in the seed, and then they would die, or be eaten by the swarms of cockroaches, millipedes, and other cave arthropod fauna that scuttled away from the club's lights. Having now accomplished the first goal of their trip, which was to see the rare and curious birds, the Trinidad and Tobago Naturalist Club set off to accomplish the second, which was to attempt to net the rare blind catfish, which is found only in this cave. This extremely rare fish was considered a prize catch for aquarists. There are areas of the cave where only people who do not suffer from claustrophobia can attempt to pass further into the inner chambers. One must wade through almost chest-high water and hold one's head at right angles to the body to be able to breathe to pass under a low shelf of rock formation before emerging into the larger chamber beyond. As a number of the Naturalist Club emerged into this last chamber, they found the Sub-Aqua Club there, and they were informed that a pair of divers, more experienced men from the British contingent, had already started their exploratory dive. The plan was to carry a roll of measuring tape in as far as they could swim for a half-life of the tanks of air, and then they would drop the roll and swim back, following the tape to the point of departure. The British Sub-Aqua Club and the Naturalist Club members gathered around, with their eyes fixed on the tape disappearing into the dark water, which flowed out from under the wall of the cave, where there was an underwater passage that led downwards to who knew where. As the two Sub-Aqua Club members began the descent into the underwater passage, spirits were high. But things did not look so promising, as the water flowing out was murky with stirred-up sediment. About 20 minutes later, the two men emerged from the hole, and pulling off their mask, they gasped in relief in the open air. Immediately, they began to explain how dangerous they had found the going in, and even more so the coming back out, where they stirred up wake, both from the action of the swimming and also from the trail of expelled air, which, as they breathed, had disrupted years of the fine sediments from the surrounding rocks, walls, and roofs. They were not so aware of this as they were going in, as they were swimming into the current, but when they turned to come back after dropping the roll of tape, they were faced with a wall of thick, impenetrable, silt-laden water, with visibility at almost zero, making it difficult to see the tape, much less the way out. The two divers had managed to follow the tape in the murk and emerge only minutes before their air ran out. They advised that due to the danger, the mission should be aborted until they had better equipment, especially lights to see underwater. The Sub-Aqua Club were using flashlights made waterproof by being wrapped in plastic bags, and there were no safety lines that they could attach to their bodies for retrieval in events as described by the first two divers. But the local Trinidadian contingent began to protest that they had not come down so far to give up so easily, and so, against the advice of the most experienced divers, two local young men, Vincent Abraham and Adam Richards, prepared to make a second attempt, at least to get as far as the drop tape, for they could see that the water was clearing up as the silt was washed out and perhaps began to settle. Vincent and Adam began to gear up for the dive when Vincent came to Hans' brother, Julius, and asked if he could borrow the small jackknife he could see hanging on Julius's belt. Julius readily lent him the knife and the slim leather belt, and, as the two young men slipped into the water, Vincent made a jest, imitating the famous Jerry Lewis diving posture, saying merrily, "Goodbye, cruel world." How prophetic these words proved to be. The water immediately clouded up again, and a sinking feeling immediately set in the stomachs of the club members watching from above. The Trinidad and Tobago Naturalist Club, who had come to attempt to capture the catfish, moved out of the chamber and made their way downstream, going towards the entrance of the cave to see if the silt would have settled out by then and allowing them to bait the fish from the hiding and to net them. In the excitement of the next hours, Hans gave up on the prospect of catching the fish as he strained his back coming into the cave, and the pain was such that the only thing he wanted to do was get back to the cars and then home. As Adam Richards and Vincent Abraham swam deeper into the unknown passage, they realised why the previous divers had warned them against entering. The crumbling rock formations made it increasingly difficult to see. Despite this, the two were determined to find the secret cavern, or at least reach the end of the previously laid spool, and continued their dive. The pair continued their dive until they reached a depth of 100 metres, or 328 feet, where the end of the spool was located. The two divers communicated with each other through signals, indicating their desire to continue deeper into the cave in search of the hidden underwater cavern, at which point the brittle ceiling of the cave suddenly collapsed, trapping Adam under piles of rock and debris. Vincent panicked and attempted to move the boulders, but his effort only caused more of the surrounding formations to crumble. Adam's lifeless body lay there, entirely covered with rocks. With no other options left, Vincent knew that he had to swim back to the surface to get help. However, the rockfall had caused the water to become filled with thick, impenetrable silt, and Vincent could not see more than a few inches in front of his mask. Without the line visible, Vincent had to rely purely on intuition and hoped that he was swimming in the right direction. Vincent had been swimming for 15 minutes, hoping that he was following the correct path. His anxiety grew with every stroke as he monitored his tanks and realized that he was running out of air. The trail of expelled air continued to disrupt the sediment that had formed on the walls for hundreds of years. He knew that he had to emerge on the other side of the silt, so he swam vigorously, hoping to break through and find the exit. But to his dismay, there was no exit to be found. Vincent had swum in the wrong direction, and he now found himself in a pitch-black void, completely devoid of any light. Despite the overwhelming sense of dread, Vincent did not panic. He was already feeling the effects of nitrogen narcosis, which was taking over his bodily functions and controlling his thoughts and movements. Instead of trying to find an exit, he started to undress himself. Slowly, he removed his mask, wetsuit, and one flipper, before finally removing his regulator. In the inky darkness, he allowed himself to sink into the abyss, accepting his fate and letting go of the struggle. As Hans and Julius made their way up the slippery slopes of the hills out of the valley, suddenly they heard the sound of running feet, and one of the sub-aqua members ran past them as if the devil was at his heels. He ignored their calls of inquiry. A few minutes after, another man, this time an Englishman, came running and paused only long enough to tell them breathlessly that they had lost 2 men. The Englishman, Louis Walsh, shrieked out they went in and did not come out, and that they were going to get more air tanks from their cars to continue the rescue efforts, as all the air they had in the cave had already been used up by the search. Members of the Naturalist Club wanted to go back to help in these efforts, but Hans dissuaded them on the grounds that more people in the crowded cave certainly would escalate the danger level, and that their flashlight batteries were almost exhausted anyhow, so it would be folly to drag back into the cave. Hans exclaimed to the group that the best thing they could do was to hurry to the Arima police station and make a report, and that he knew a professional diver who he would try to contact when they get to a phone. A while later, the 2 men came running back, grey-faced with exhaustion, and carrying fresh tanks of air to enable them to continue the search for the missing men. About an hour later, Hans made the report to the police at Arima station from the little information he had, and then headed to the home of John Dunstan, who lived on the outskirts of Arima, using his phone to try and contact Malcolm Brown, who was an old field diver of some experience. It took quite a while before Hans managed to get in contact with Malcolm. He was attending a Southern Games, a yearly popular sports event held at Gurukea Park in Pointe-à-Pierre. Hans explained the situation to him as best he could, and Malcolm told him that he would try his best to assemble a team and equipment and rendezvous at the Arima police station, where he expected he could get more current news of the status of the developing tragedy. At the Arima police station where, by then, word had spread to the families of the missing men, they were gathered in a group outside the station, where there was speculation as to what had happened, and there was some hope that the two men had found the fabled inner cave, or at least a pocket of air, and were there awaiting their rescue. As Hans could do little more, he left for home. Upon reaching the entrance of the Cumaca cave, Malcolm Brown and his brother, accompanied by a team of helpers and several donkeys carrying the necessary equipment, which included powerful lights and safety harnesses, prepared for the hazardous dive ahead. As the rescue team stepped into the dark trail, they carefully maneuvered themselves and equipment under the low shelf formations before emerging in the last chamber, where they found the British Sub-Aqua Club in total disarray. Ethan Schwartz warmly greeted Malcolm Brown and his team before providing them with an overview of the situation. After receiving all the necessary details, Malcolm and his brother then began to prepare their diving equipment for their descent into the unknown passage. With Malcolm in the lead, the pair began the rescue mission, fully aware that they had no idea what awaited them in the depths. As they swam past boulders and rocky formations, they had to be extremely careful, making sure not to touch or bump into anything that might cause the walls to crumble further or send debris cascading down onto them. The sound of their breathing echoed through the passage as they pushed forward, the water becoming increasingly colder and darker as they descended further. Upon reaching a depth of 100 meters, or 328 feet, Malcolm and his brother noticed a roll of tape that had been dropped by the Sub-Aqua Club during their initial descent. However, upon closer inspection, they discovered that the tape was defective, having been broken and haphazardly taped back together with what appeared to be common sellotape. Unfortunately, the water had softened the joint, causing the tape to come apart, rendering it useless. Even if the two lost divers had managed to locate the spool, it would have led them nowhere, adding to the already perilous situation. After scanning the area further, Malcolm noticed an immense amount of fallen rocks and boulders on the floor of the passage. His intuition told him that this was not just a coincidence, and that something had caused the rockfall. He signaled to his brother to stop and inspected the rocks more closely. It was at this moment when Malcolm's heart sank as he noticed the lifeless body of Adam Richards buried under the heap of rubble. With only one arm, leg and tank visible in the murky waters, it was clear that Richards had suffered a fatal accident and had been trapped under the fallen rocks for some time. Realizing that moving the rocks could cause further damage to the already unstable cave structure, Malcolm and his brother decided to carefully take note of where they found Adam's body and continued their search for Vincent Abraham. As Malcolm and his brother ventured deeper into the passage, reaching a depth of 160 meters, or 525 feet, Malcolm's attention was drawn to a glimmer in the murky waters. Upon closer inspection, he identified it as a flipper, still attached to the body of Vincent Abraham. The sight of Vincent's naked body with only one flipper left them struck with disbelief. With Vincent's body safely secured in a body bag, Malcolm and his brother began their ascent to the surface. However, they were about to discover the true danger of the cave. As they reached a depth of 75 meters, or 246 feet, the ceiling suddenly began to crumble without any warning. The already murky waters became even more silt-laden, making it difficult for them to see and find the line they had laid upon entering the cave. Their flashlights were of no use as they desperately searched for the exit. It felt like an eternity, but finally, Malcolm's brother was able to find the line in the silt, and they clung to it for dear life, hoping it had not been moved and would lead them out. The cave continued to crumble as they made their way upwards, passing depths of 60 meters, 50 meters, and 40 meters. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the brothers emerged into the large chamber where the Sub-Aqua Club members had been anxiously waiting for any news. With a deep sense of relief, the Brown brothers expressed their gratitude for being out of the treacherous cave. They reiterated to the members of the Sub-Aqua Club what they already knew. The passage they had ventured into was incredibly hazardous, with walls that crumbled without warning. They shared the news of Vincent's body, which they had brought up from the depths, and informed them about Adam's trapped body, which proved too dangerous to retrieve. When he told Adam's father, who had travelled into the cave that night, what he found of his son, the elder Richards had pragmatically reasoned in that Adam was dead and virtually buried already, and it was not wise to risk any more lives to reach the body. In those years, the daily newspapers were not published on a Monday, but that Tuesday, the 24th, there was maximum coverage of the tragedy, where more details and photos were given of the rescue efforts and how though they had recovered the body of Victor. The headline screamed, "Nightmare Death Pool at Cumaca," among other sensational sentences, and even a week later, the Sunday Guardian bannered, "Chambers of Horrors in Picturesque Countryside." It is a strange passing how this event has touched Han Boo's family. Several years later, his cousin Nigel Booz was hiking in the same river near the entrance of the cave when he stumbled upon a bone that he suspected to be human. He immediately sent it to Sir Henry Pierre, a well-known Trinidadian surgeon, who identified it as a tibula, or a human leg bone. Considering all other coincidences, it was highly probable that this bone belonged to Adam Richards. The cave was giving up its dead. This has been Gripping Horror. I hope to see you in the next one.